Privacy is sacred. It's a person's fundamental right to enjoy privacy, yet the extent of that enjoyment depends on the level of protection afforded to the individual's personal data to prevent its exploitation or misuse either by the state, NGOs or the private sector. We really are at an impasse as the digital revolution unfolds and privacy is becoming more and more relevant as exchanges of personal data are carried out more and more online. However, at this rate we are doomed to play catch-up. For legislators, that means doing all that is within our power to prevent the misuse of information and protect individuals from the harm that such exploitation can cause, particularly when it comes to interactions online. Not only do we need to catch up with the lawlessness and illegal activity carried out in large swaths of the internet, we also need to protect people's personal data from commercial exploitation. Recent and ongoing developments with regards to Cambridge Analytica and Facebook advertising, micro-targeting and manipulating personal information is an example of just how we need to play catch-up. Hundreds of millions of people around the world have already had their data breached, and I would bet that figure is much higher than we are made aware of. What is so alarming is not that not only was personal data used without consent to maximise profits, data was used to undermine and manipulate democratic systems through third-party interference, as we have seen in the Trump election and Brexit referendum. My concerns are now with the forthcoming referendum on the 8th Amendment. This bill has come far too late in that regard, and already the online community are seeing the effects of that lawlessness, as people have noted fake Facebook profiles, online quizzes and polls disguised as one side but revealing to be from the opposite side. This has left people's online profiles vulnerable to harvesting, micro-targeting and manipulating for the sake of political and private sector profit. The current lack of transparency enables external third parties to use social media to sway opinion. Some have already called the 8th Amendment referendum a post-truth campaign, as Facebook algorithms continue to allow highly emotive content to get prominence. Facebook still allows countries from outside to target specific groups of voters in Ireland by buying Facebook ads. And many around the world will be watching closely to see what extent data will be harnessed for political purposes. We have rightly been focusing a lot of our attention on Russia and cyber warfare, but the bigger question will be how democracies can protect themselves against interference from foreign interests on all sides, and more importantly, how people's data can be protected from such exploitation. Placing the onus on companies to self-regulate will be a futile effort, and efforts to date carried out by large online conglomerates such as Facebook and Google have proven efforts to be futile. We have seen to date the lack of will coming from private sector conglomerates to do much to tackle political influence and disinformation, so it has left us to address this ourselves. The only chance for us to address these issues here in Ireland is to get it right in this bill. I echo concerns raised at Shannon Stage for the need to amend Section 45 to prevent the likes of Cambridge Analytica and other political consultation firms to exploit the loophole currently in place as the bill stands. The bill as it stands will do nothing to prevent companies like Cambridge Analytica to be hired by candidates or political parties and giving them permission to harvest and process personal data for the purposes of political interests. I understand that the Minister did make some amendments to limit the impact of Section 45 on other European countries, but failed to address the outstanding loophole which remains in place. I would like to commend Senator Higgins for proposing amendments to explicitly prohibit private or commercial firms processing this data on behalf of previously mentioned categories or without explicit consent from data subjects. This amendment would not prevent polling or focus groups as they are done with the explicit consent of the individual, but it would effectively prohibit data mining and targeting firms like Cambridge Analytica from interfering with an electoral or reform process. While I support the endeavours to protect personal data across the board, I have concerns over the practical implementation of the GDPR system in the context of public representation. TD's offices lack resources and time in particular to review the entirety of our database and make sure that all unnecessary data is deleted. I would also suggest that we look at a more modern ways to process, save and store data that will help facilitate the GDPR process. For example, providing timely reminders when data must be deleted after 2 years. Another cornerstone of democracy is the ability to access your public representatives. Myself and other deputies in this House go to great lengths to facilitate this as best as we can. In my duty as a public representative in Donegal, there could be up to 100 miles between my constituency office and Mallinhead, for example, where somebody could be contacting me from. And I would be only able to help that individual by getting verbal consent over the phone as opposed to written consent. And I would also deal with individuals who have literacy problems or who are not computer literate and do not use emails. The law needs to be clearer here on how we can deal with vulnerable adults in our constituencies as public representatives. I understand that verbal consent is accepted, but it is not considered best practice to protect both ourselves and our constituents from data breaches. This puts TDs at an automatic disadvantage here because often verbal consent is all we have as we deal with time-sensitive issues or people in crisis situations. That is why people come to us. They have nowhere else to turn. The fact that constituents access their TDs for a plethora of reasons is a symptom of a dysfunctional system to start with. Oftentimes people are intimidated or don't understand the workings of our social welfare or health system or don't feel the process is transparent enough for them to trust it. Believe it or not, people do trust politicians to navigate through these bureaucratic behemoths on their behalf and hold the government and its departments to account. Deputies in this House deal with a large amount of personal data, and yes, we should be held to account for protecting it as it passes through our hands. However, any efforts to enforce greater protection of personal data should not inadvertently place barriers for constituents accessing their democratically elected public representative. And I hope that there will be further clarification of the implications of this bill has on public representation as the bill progresses. I understand that Minister Flanagan introduced an amendment to Section 139 during report stage to allow fines for public bodies to an upper limit of €1 million. If the government had considered initially with implementing GDPR within government bodies, then maybe they understand the difficulties they would face when GDPR is rolled out in May. I would hope that throughout the latter stages of this bill, we can collectively within the House look at ways to improve rolling out the GDPR in the context of our constituency office, which does not place an unnecessary burden on both our offices and our staff, but also on our constituents. Ireland already has a terrible record holding the private sector to account for white-collar crime. Neither do we bother collecting the tax that is rightly ours. We also allow for multinationals to avoid tax completely. If we are serious about the right to privacy, we must ensure that compliance is monitored and enforced, and enforcement is carried out upon prosecution. Too often legislation passes through this House with grand gestures, but with little resources attached to ensure the effective application. I would ask whether government intends to increase resources allocated to the ODCE to ensure compliance in relation to the GDPR, in relation to the private sector, and if SIPO will also be given the necessary clarification as to its remit and be awarded the necessary resources to oversee compliance in government and government departments. Thank you.
Tommy Bruin.
Thanks, Carola, and delighted to have the opportunity